That's something on it. All right. Good to see you all. That's what I'm saying. For those at home, watching the video. Here's how it call. But we're continuing Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed. The next assigned section was part 2, which is called Beginnings, 1934 to 1942. Just 2 chapters. Initial impressions, thoughts. This covered the Chalk Maze arrival to Les Chambon and some of the first kind of resistances. We still don't have the story of how they started doing the hiding and the sheltering of the Jews. We'll get to that, but kind of setting the stage here. What did you all think of this section? Anything stand out?
I just thought how horrible it would have been to live in that time. You know, the secrecy and neighbors telling on neighbors.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, no, you wouldn't have known who you could trust and who you couldn't.
Yeah.
Especially in France at the time, it was split. Opposite halves, you know, between the Vichy and the Free.
Yeah. And it sounded like there was this kind of echo effect where Germany would do something and then Northern France would do, and then it wasn't long before it was still happening, even though they were the free zone. There was still this sort of, pattern. Yeah, can you imagine the fear of the Gestapo and not knowing who was reporting and who was, man?
I keep asking myself as I read it, though, what would I have done in that situation? What stand would I have taken if Gestapo got me done?
Yeah. That's part of what the function of a book like this is. What would you do? But I appreciate that it isn't just, I think I mentioned this last week, there's a show on ABC, it was kind of a spin-off of 2020, called like, What Would You Do? I believe the reporter is John Quinones or something like that. And they have these almost like candid camera situations, but instead of comedy, it's how would you react? I appreciate that in this book, he's very clear about the circumstances that had to come together for this to happen. Andre Trocmé's upbringing, his mother's death, and the World War I Germans going through his town, and the gray man looking at him through the gate in the wall like, oh, you know. So all of that happened to him, and then this town, this village, being Huguenots and having lived through, and they were already not really trusting of outsiders. What's the line? Talking about how they had 9 months. Where is it? 9 months of 9 months of winter and 3 months of trouble. Yeah. About the tourists. So all those things had to come together for this.
The fact that they were Huguenots and not Catholics, like most of the French were, made it a little easier, because they were already segregated in their own minds and in the minds of most Frenchmen. So it was easier for them than it would have been for the open population.
So not a lot of outsiders would move to there.
Yeah.
And they already were a close community. So that helps keep, the informants away, because they already were kind of us against the world attitude.
I know Erna talks about, she has a different perspective of things.
Of course.
But she said what people forget, it wasn't just the Jewish people that were arrested and
Oh, no.
that there were many, many others. And she feels that history has kind of
Drop them.
focused on one group and left off the others. Because she talked about when she was a little girl, her dad would send her to the field with the older sister had to go work in the fields because the men were in the army, and her dad would send her too because the Russian soldiers would rape. And so many of the girls in the fields, but if there was a little child with them, they would tend to leave them alone. And so she was sent to the fields with her big sister.
So yeah, there were Russians that got put in concentration camps. Anybody who, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, German Lutheran pastor, but he was part of the resistance. He got it. They went after.
Well, she was afraid of the Russian soldiers.
They tried to eliminate all the gypsies.
gypsies, yeah,
Did a pretty good job of
Well,
that.
they did a pretty good job of wiping them out, yeah.
but, gay and lesbian people.
Right.
If you were developmentally disabled, so think of our folks from Hanover Adult Center that have been visiting, they would have been euthanized. They would have been said they don't contribute anything to society
Experiment.
or experiment.
Exactly.
And that's how this book started, was this author, as an ethicist, studying the Nazis breaking and re-breaking the bones of Jewish children so they could study healing. You know, the stuff they did to twins, you know, it's. So the Jews were by and far the biggest group, the most public group they went after, and so, yeah, they get
That
most
was
of
who
the
they
attention.
demonized as the other.
But you're right, and Ernest right, there's plenty of other people that were victims
Well, one of the things,
of the regime.
one of the things that were schizophrenic was that they would come into a town, Poles or Jews or whatever they are, and if the child looked Aryan, they'd steal them,
Yeah,
and then they were not Jewish anymore.
that's a part of warfare that gets not as much talked about, is stealing children. I mean,
Like the
Russians are doing it
Russians
now.
who were, yes, stealing Ukrainian children and making them.
But I mean, it's.
in
to
like
me, it was a-
Central America, they would, you know, steal children and indoctrinate them into the gangs. Yeah,
But
it's-
what's ironic though, is they would take these children that look Aryan,
Mhm.
and they were Jewish, but they were no longer Jewish after that, you know, it's with the.
Oh, and that Hitler was an Aryan himself, right?
Yeah,
So
no, he wasn't.
there's a lot of mental gymnastics that has to happen to go along with anything like this.
There's an excellent book, I've talked to you about this before once, The Book Thief.
I've heard of it.
Have any of you ever heard of this book?
Yeah.
Have you read it?
I think my book club did.
It is excellent, and it's called The Book Thief.
Yes.
It does
Yeah.
focus on the German people and what they went through, you know, not as the main target, but they were definitely, just as oppressed and
Well,
hungry
that
and
that's the
desperate.
one where neighbors were telling our neighbors even.
I'm not sure, I read it,
Yeah.
it was
A long time ago.
Samantha and Danielle's ninth grade, a ninth or tenth grade reading assignment, summer reading, you know, for AP
I
English.
think it
whatever.
is technically.
It
used
is so
fiction.
good though, the narrator is deaf. And that just drew me in immediately, you know, it's like, you know, yeah, like, it was a good year for death, you know what I mean, like, but it was very dark, yes, it really was. At the end though, it ends on a hopeful note, but, it talks about how children were forced to join the Nazi youth, things of that nature, so it is an excellent book, if you're interested in trying to look at it from an alternate perspective.
I didn't think it's an old book.
I-
My book already.
Yeah. Well, Danielle and Samantha are graduated high school in 13, so we're talking over a dozen years ago that I read this book, but I would read it again. I own it actually, like I don't always buy books. I bought that one.
Were you gonna say something?
Yeah, I was gonna say, you know, he was talking about earlier about what would you do in a situation, you know, a scenario. When I was in the military, we had a uniform that was not a normal uniform, it was all black with red stripes and black tie and everything like that, and a regular hat. And it makes you feel different than you would when you were in other clothes.
Sure.
And so there was a comment made one time, says, why did the Germans dress like they did? They were so out there in their uniforms.
Mhm.
Well, I can understand why that works, because it changes your personality when you wear those types of uniforms.
Sure.
And what put me in that situation, being German, if I was there at that time in the early 30s, I'm afraid, looking back at my personality and how I felt in that uniform, because I've been there,
Mhm.
I can see myself joining Hitler Youth back then if I'd been a kid.
That's one of the
It
lessons.
would have been right in my personality at the time.
That's one of the things you learn from history, is it's really easy to sit here now and look back and you'll be like, well, I wouldn't have done those things, but.
And the only reason I got that perspective is because that uniform I was wearing in the service, it changes your personality to some degree while you're wearing it. And people ask, well, why the Germans look so wild in uniforms? Because they had some psychological
Yeah,
effect on the people that were wearing it.
and as we mentioned last week too, they've been in horrible economic situation following World War One. Inflation was through the roof, right? And people were suffering. They were looking for things to blame, and there was a lot of blame going around in the Republic at the time. And then, well, who, you know, then came the voice that said, well, let's focus all of it on this group of scapegoats.
And I can
Start rallying people around it.
being honest with myself, I could find myself in the Hitler Youth at that point.
Yeah, and that's what we talked about last week too, was he said it wasn't just, he had this epiphany, this light bulb moment. It wasn't just good and evil. It was good and evil, and he said stupid, but that maybe it wasn't charitable, just good and evil, and folks that just kind of didn't push past their own ignorance or their own like, because then you'd have to pick a side, and then it'd be way more responsibility and weight on you, and let me just keep my head down, right? So self-preservation, neither good nor evil. And they even talked about that here too, that the village, you know, when what's his name, Lamarand or something, the French official who comes to the village in chapter 4 to do the big youth celebration, and he's like, what is with this place, right? Well, their resistance didn't register at first because it wasn't black and white, right? It wasn't straight up military resistance or protests. It was this quiet gray, this quiet resistance, and that stayed off their radar for a while.
The artist's husband was in it, but it was, to them, it was like the kids.
Boy Scouts.
Yeah, it's like what artist's husband, when he was a kid. But it was just follow the leader, and if anybody knew him, he had a very strong personality.
Yeah, I don't think follow the leader is not the point. I think, considering the situation they were in at the time, and he was bringing them out of that hole and putting them to work. If he'd have died in 1938, he'd be considered a hero right now.
Sure,
So,
but it was also this like expression of patriotism.
Yeah, so I could see myself with the military and the way they were militarizing everybody. I could see myself in the Hitler
Oh,
Youth.
I think there's a lot of the kids.
And I'd be lying to you if I didn't say that.
Right. No, that's,
Oh, sure.
a lot of people wouldn't be able to say that about themselves. Okay, well, I think clearly we know the history. And then we've already talked about that a few times of how many books we've read and movies we've seen and classes you've been in and everything from Anne Frank to Book Thief. You know, this is a well-documented chapter of history, for very good reasons. One of the things they talked about, we mentioned last week too, was that this wasn't the big battles that would make the headlines. This was again, a quiet resistance. So I'm glad this has been lifted up. And so more than just being a history textbook, he's trying to paint the picture, right, to give you the full feel. And, you know, it might seem a little bit artistic, but we start in chapter 3 with the Chalkmays arriving to the village, and he's kind of almost getting poetical about this washed out, everything's gray, there's no life here, right? It's just the 9 months of winter and 3 months of trouble. And they get to the presbytery, which is like a parsonage, and it's just this gray. And so they bring in bright rugs and curtains and play the piano and flowers, and they bring some life to this. And it's more than just that he was a charismatic preacher and teacher and person, because he was. But as we said, he was going into their homes and sitting with them in their kitchens and listening. He'd share what he wanted to share, but he connected with each household and found the way, the things they had in common, and shared the gospel and the message of scripture and built this up. And again, we'll get back to how they started doing the fake IDs and sheltering people. But at this stage, all we know is that they're in this together. So he gets to this and builds this up. They talk about conscientious objectors, which normally I think in our history classes we would associate with Vietnam, but it was very much going on here in France. Nonviolence was a very important tenet for Chalkmay, and he was able to share that with his neighbors here too. They mentioned Jesus as nonviolence, but think Gandhi, think Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis and sit-ins and all the civil rights in our country. India went through nonviolent protests and overthrows. So it's not new, it's not unique to France, but that's tapping into that kind of a sphere. Let's see, let's look at page 83. Oh, do your editions have the photos in the middle? Did you look at the pictures of the parsonage and the town?
Oh, boy.
Yeah, there's an overview shot of the village up on the plateau. There's the Chalkmay family with the 4 kids. And then there's the picture of the poetic gate, which is a gate inside a gate. And then another shot of the presbytery itself. Right? And then you
Why
get,
would they call it presbytery? Because that's what the Presbyterians call their parsonages.
yeah, presbytery means, like a presbyter is an elder. It's kind of like a deacon or an elder in the church.
So this didn't have anything to do with the Presbyterian church then?
No, it's
Okay.
just what they refer to the parsonage. It's where you put, it's where you house your church elder, your pastor.
Well, because we're Presbyterian, that's what we call the parsonage.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And then there's that picture of the temple itself too, with the sign over the door in French, but it says love one another. Aimez-vous, I don't know French. Aimez-vous les, I can't read, les uns les autres. Love one another. Anybody ever study French? Can you pronounce that better? Okay, well, moving on then. Page 83. Let's see, down towards the bottom, this is about nonviolence, right? Chalkmay's and Tisa's nonviolence had a more stable foundation than that of confidence in the Germans. It was based upon the belief that in the Bible, God told us not to kill our fellow man and gave that commandment utter clarity in the life and death of Jesus Christ. And Chalkmay had a practical belief, a belief that held out for him a promise of success. He believed that love, that feeling, thinking, and acting as if life is precious beyond all price, would manage to find a way to restrain what his notes call diabolical forces like Nazis. I feel like that sets up the theme of the next couple of chapters. That love, feeling, thinking, acting like life is precious beyond all price, would manage to find a way to push back against this. And later on, it talks about how caring was infectious, about how the local police and other officials would oftentimes send an anonymous call to say there was a raid coming, or look the other way, or somehow support what they were doing, or at least not enforce what they should have been. So that's kind of the foundation here, the core of where he's coming from. I mean, when Peter pulls a sword in, I think, Luke's gospel, and lops off the ear of the high priest's servant, Jesus, the other ones, all of them say, put the sword away. But in Luke especially, and Luke was a doctor, a physician, right? And Luke's gospel highlights Jesus's healings and compassion a lot more. Jesus not only tells him to put the sword away, but he heals the guy's ear. Do we need to crack the door?
Yes, please.
As long as it doesn't get too loud or we're not too loud for anybody else.
And those windows don't open?
No.
No, not anymore.
The one time there still doesn't print.
Yeah,
Yeah, they don't open, no.
Oh,
So, nope, had it, I lost it again. Healing the ear.
Yeah.
Not only does Jesus go to the cross, but he also heals this guy's ear. He says, love your enemies. While hanging on the cross, he says, forgive them, for they don't know what they do, right? There's all these instances where Jesus really does model this nonviolence. And it also gets into the difference between nonviolence and pacifism. Because pacifism sometimes has the connotation of passivity, that you just sit back and don't do anything. But as many of these movements have shown over history, it's not that you don't do anything. They're still pushing back and resisting. They just refuse to kill or to condone violence to reach their ends. And so they fight off paralysis, it says. They try to dissipate the fog of doubt. Yeah. Let's see. There's a lot of things to talk about. I'm trying to hit the highlights so we don't run out of time. The natural soul is more precious than particular human lives. That's page 90, paragraph, the first paragraph. First full paragraph, page 90. Where they're saluting the flags, right? Remember that passage where they come up with the workaround where the school across the street has a flagpole already, so we'll just go to their flag, and then eventually they would go but not salute, and then they just kind of stopped coming and it dwindled. Till they weren't doing the thing that they were legally being told to do saluting the flag. There, I will say, I don't know if we've talked about this before, but maybe y'all have had this conversation in other years. There was a practice, and especially after World War II, since Lutherans in this country were associated with Germans, and they wanted to put a little distance between Nazis and American Lutherans, where folks started putting the flags in the sanctuary. That didn't used to be the case, so now we have an American flag in the sanctuary and a Christian flag. But there are a lot of churches who over time have said, get those flags out of there. That it sends a mixed message. Who is our allegiance to? Is it to God, our Lord Jesus? Is it to the country? If you want to have a flag, that's fine, put it outside, but don't have it in the sanctuary. And there have been instances where church councils or pastors have said, okay, we're taking the flags out, and boy, that's like the third.
It was a big controversy here.
Was it?
When, several years ago, when Grover Newell was, yeah, and
You got, it,
yeah, he bought the flag and put it down, and then other people objected, and, I think it was left in, I think.
Yeah, it's still there. We took them out for stripping of the altar a couple of years ago, left them in the fellowship hall for a while. Partly just because we forgot, but after a while, it was like, oh, I wonder what people will say. Well, they want them to be back. So there's,
I think.
this is
if you
extreme,
were a
but it
vet-
makes me
if you
think.
were a
of-
veteran,
Sure.
or have tied to that, you feel stronger about it than people who never served in the military. Yeah, probably, maybe not, but.
And I'm not saying take down all the flags, but there is a question that many have discussed, should there be a flag in a church?
Quakers flag, the American flag. Because aren't they really very committed to pacifism and, just asking just to God purely.
I know we had some Jehovah's Witnesses in elementary school, and they
Yeah,
weren't allowed to participate
Oh,
in
yeah.
any holidays or say the pledge.
Never said it first.
My grandmother, the Mercer side of my family were Quakers in Pennsylvania, and we have something written where they wrote, they did not join the military, this was back in the Revolution, they did not join the military, but they set up a hospital for wounded soldiers. So they participated in the way that they could, they supported it, but they did not actually serve in the military.
That reminds me of these people, they are committed to pacifism. What were you gonna say, Judy? You have a name?
Oh, I was just gonna say that we have a new neighbor who's a Quaker, and he's, had a flag with him.
Does she? Okay, it was just a curiosity.
I don't know, she has a flag.
Little.
You sure there's one Libby left?
Well, let's flip a couple pages. This chapter is getting into, the chapter's called the Presbyterian flag, so. They arrived, and then this was like the first kind of quiet but still public form of resistance besides just hiding people. So page 91, somebody read the paragraph that starts apparently.
Apparently, the government was unaware that a few people had refused, at least symbolically, to give up their consciences to the chief of state. But the 3,000 people of La Chambon were fully aware of what had happened. Moreover, they saw that they could resist. There was a possibility of resisting. But then it was like having a new, beautifully colored bird pointed out, a bird that had not been seen before. But now they saw it. They knew from their own experience that there was such a bird and it could come back. The bird was the possibility of a person saying no to indignity and tyranny. And in their recusant Protestant hearts, they cherished that bird.
Thank you. So grounded in scripture. And also kind of forged in the fire of the town and Chocnay's personal experiences and history. Here's this resistance. And it started with Chocnay and Tees and Darsasac at the school across the street. They'd already started trying to shelter Jews, but this was the first public thing, and the rest of the town saw that. They didn't make a big deal out of it. They didn't say, hey, everybody, look what we're doing. They just let their actions speak for themselves, but that lit something in the village. In other places, it talks about originality, right? So it generated originality, these impulses, creativity, and courage. So starts as something small. How many Christians were martyred by the Romans, by the Catholic Church, if they didn't, line up or toe the line, by various regimes in Africa, China, by just small acts of resistance that inspired other people. And not just for the sake of resistance, because it was based in this faith. On the flip side, if you look to page 93, the last full paragraph there. Somebody read that one.
These refusals of blind obedience worked. Vichy did not strike, and the people of Rochambeau found themselves discovering not only that the government of France was trying to steal their consciousness under the mask of loyalty, but also that they themselves would prevent the theft without being smashed in reprisal. At the end of the first few months of the first academic year of the occupation, the Chambonnais found themselves, to their mild surprise, living peacefully and stubbornly in obedience to the command that is written above the main door of the temple: love one another.
Thank you. So I like that phrase. The government of France was trying to steal their consciences under the mask of loyalty. But they found, to their surprise, that they could be stubborn like they already were and push back. When we got at the beginning of the chapter, the part about the 9 months of winter and 3 months of trouble, it also says that they have this sort of saying that goes with the town. That translates to something like a shrug, like, well, what do you expect? Here's another bad, kind of like Murphy's Law, what do you expect? But here, to their mild surprise, they can live peacefully and stubbornly in obedience to this other slogan, love one another. Right? So he found a way to use their stubbornness and their kind of fatalism, but turn it into a different direction. Any other thoughts on chapter 3? Okay. Chapter 4, we get the bell and the empty buses. The story of the bell, right? Every town's supposed to ring their bell at 12 o'clock on this day to celebrate the first anniversary of the head of the kind of Vichy government. And had you ever heard of Darbyists before?
What are they?
There's this other religious group, this other Protestant group that didn't believe in churches or any kind of organized anything. You just, you live your faith. Yeah. So they had this Darbyist woman named Amelie who worked at the church and custodian and was supposed to ring the bell, but because again, Chocmay had found this connection with her and this relationship, and she just refused to ring the bell. These two out-of-towners from, were like, well, you need to ring the bell. But then it was raining and they didn't want their fancy clothes to get messed up, so they left, right? And then she's got this little smirk, right? She's like smiling. She got to stand up to them, right? So there was the spirit of resistance. The word he used a lot was abjuring, which is like, you wouldn't abjure, you wouldn't leave behind, you wouldn't abandon these things that are important to you. So, any other thoughts on that story of the bell ringing?
Situations and not, because Proclamation didn't say, don't ring the bell.
Right.
Right, she just didn't ring it because she hadn't been told not to, or to do it by Proclamation. She wasn't gonna do it once he told her. So God used that situation to.
And I love that in this bleak place where they have a name for the winter wind, where they just are, their kind of motto had been like, well, what do you expect? That she's got this little smirk on her face, that they're finding life and trying to preserve life.
She was driving because she stood with her arms against the door and there was a lintel that kept her driving.
Yep, she called her bluff. All right. the biggest passage, the biggest story that I wanted to try to spend more time on is this whole sequence of the visit, right? Of the official coming down for this youth day, and they're supposed to have a big celebration, but the whole thing is very kind of muted. And that turns into, well, this letter that he presents that the youth, but Chalkley probably helped write it, that the youth present to this big time official, kind of pushing back, and there's all this confrontation, and the line has been crossed now. And then they send the buses to find the Jews, but they already had chance at time to hide the Jews. I'll start this section, page 101. So they say that, so the chaplain, a Swiss chaplain, gives this sermon, this reflection. And sometimes folks will say that when Jesus was on the cross and he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's quoting Psalm 22, but that we're supposed to think not just of that line of the psalm, but the entirety of the psalm, which goes on to say, you know, but I trust you, right? But you've been with me through this time, so I'll trust you now too. In this case, we're not sure how much of Romans 13 this Swiss preacher cited, but our author, Philip Halley, is bringing in the whole context of the whole thing. So could somebody read that big paragraph there that starts, it was a rather cool day?
It was a rather cool day up there on the plateau, even though it was mid-August. The Chamonix gave a short talk on the 13th chapter of St. Paul's epistle to the Romans. It had to do with the respect due to authorities.
This wasn't the Swiss preacher, apologies.
What?
I was wrong, this wasn't the Swiss guy, apologies, keep going.
You want to keep reading this?
Yeah.
Therefore, he who resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. And it urges Christians to do their civic duties, like paying taxes and honoring those to whom official honor is due. But it goes on to say, owe no one anything except to love one another, for he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. The commandments, you shall not kill, you shall not steal, you shall not covet, and any other commandment are summed up in the sentence, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Love does not do wrong to a neighbor. To anyone who knew the chapter and the people who watched and knew it well, the ethic of neighborly love demanded not a bitter confrontation with the government, but a perfunctory minimal respect for the governing authorities, with a firm but quiet hint that there are limits to that respect, limits set by the commandment not to do wrong to a neighbor.
Thank you. And then Lamoran was puzzled. He prepared a long speech, but replied with only a few words. Then it's the Swiss pastor. Gave a sermon on the theme of obedience to the state when the state does not try to force people to violate the laws of God. It does not try to violate the law that sums them all up. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's what the Swiss pastor gave. So right out of the open there, they're kind of calling these folks out.
You know what? It's up there on page 101 where it says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. Therefore, he who resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. Well, there's some point at which that person who's resisting has to look at himself, well, I'm just trying to.
Therefore, he who resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and urges Christians to do their civic duties, like paying taxes and honoring those to whom the official honor is due, but it goes on to say, owe no one anything except the love of one another.
That's like Jesus
He who
saying,
loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law.
like Jesus saying, you know,
So
pay unto Caesar what is Caesar's.
Right,
Yeah.
like as if, yes, go ahead and do that, but that's not the important thing. The important thing is to love one another.
Respect the structures, right? There was a very much an emphasis in Bible times and Luther's time. There's these authorities and structures, right? So in the commandment, in Luther's explanation of the fourth commandment to honor your mother and father, he doesn't just stop there at mother and father. He says, and the governing authorities, the police and the pastors and the teachers, like anybody who's in a position of authority, you pay them the respect. But the implied thing here is if at any point those authorities stop abiding in the other things that God has appointed, like loving your neighbor, that's when the prophets come out. That's when the prophets come out to say, hey, this isn't supposed to be right. That's when the resistance comes out. Like if the fill in the blank, the mother, the father is being abusive, if the police are abusing their power, if the governing authorities are doing things like they were here, then at that point, love your neighbor becomes the commandment that is above all the other commandments, and neighborly love demands, okay, we'll respect the authorities. But in the meantime, then we're gonna completely,
There's a real fine line there.
Yes, there is.
and different people would say like, well, I'm picking God over my government by not paying taxes, right? Like you could draw that, a lot of people draw the line in a lot of different places. But the point being, if it really comes down to you're not, the love of neighbor isn't happening. And your love of neighbor then puts you in a position where you have to resist what God has appointed in terms of earthly structures. Then that priority flips is what they're saying.
One of C.S. Lewis's books, it might be, I don't think it's called The Case for Christ, but it's something about right and wrong. It just says we know what is right and we know what is wrong instinctually, you know, we know it is right to love someone,
Most
help them.
Most
Well, I think that's the way God intended it, you know what I mean? Absolutely, yes. Well, and knowing it and doing it are not always in accord either, you know, for various reasons, but that's what this makes me think of, is that we know what we're being called to do by Christ, love one, you know, and is it easy? Not always, but, you know.
And that might be why in years after this, but when people would try to interview these villagers,
Mhm.
they'd say like, wow, what did it mean to you to do the right thing? Where did you find the strength to do this? And they're like, it wasn't what we were doing, just doing this because it was the right thing. Back off, everybody.
Right. But like, don't make a big deal of this, because this is just what we needed, what we knew was right, you know?
Somewhere in there, he talked about not doing it in the spirit of mysticism or something like that, and he said that.
A spirit of what?
Of mysticism.
Oh,
mystic.
oh,
Mhm.
And I'm not really sure what he meant by that. It sounded like he was saying that you shouldn't do it from maybe kind of like a sentimental thing. You should do it because you really love. I'm not.
I think Chakmay was very much a concrete kind of a person. And so there's a place in Christianity for mysticism and dreams and the visions that some of the saints have shared over the centuries. But as far as he was concerned, I think Luther maybe would say the same thing about the book of Revelation. Well, that's all well and good. But if it doesn't help you actually live your faith in daily life and love your neighbor, then don't do it. Don't make that your priority.
Something in here that was surprising about that.
I'm not remembering exactly what it was, if you find it.
Yeah.
Okay.
You shouldn't do it because of your being, because your faith is mystic or something like that. And
Okay, well, if you come across it, let me know. We get the letter that's presented by the youth. I'm actually gonna talk about this in my sermon today. This really hit me this week, but not the letter itself, but did you read the circumstances of the Jews that were forced into that stadium in Paris?
oh,
And they didn't have food, they didn't have air, people were dying, people were sick, and then they separated the families and put them on trains. Just horrific. Now, they didn't know all of that, and there was this story that the prefect fed him about, well, no, they're gonna go to Poland, they're establishing a zone for the Jews there, where they'll have their own lives, right? And he gets into that the concentration camps weren't public knowledge yet. That the Nazis had this campaign of, what did they call it? I wrote it down somewhere. It was like, I don't remember what it was called, but it was like fog and like, they didn't want people. They wanted to sell them the story of a zone in Poland and things like that.
You know, things are so great over there now. Pastor Liz Yates is headed there before Easter.
Over to the Holy Land?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm shocked that she's going there right
Yeah,
now.
well, she and daughter's going with her,
Yeah.
but they have, the government now, she has to register with the US Embassy now to go. Which I guess that means that.
Pastor
She's
Liz
preached
Yates.
here before. Liz Yates, an older lady like my age. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yes, summer,
Yeah.
Yeah, she has already put in her order. She's bringing back a lot of things from the Holy Land, like crosses and so forth to sell, so. I don't know whether she'll get over here to share them or not, but I wish she would, but she's all excited about going. She
Yeah.
doesn't seem to be afraid, but, and she stays with a local family when
Yeah.
she goes.
Yeah, she's
They'll let her
big
in.
into the Arab Christian, right?
The Palestinian Christians.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, what Israel ended up being with all of its problems and how they handled that. That's a reality. The Germans were trying to say that they were going to set something up like that in Poland, but that was a complete lie. Yeah. So, they present this letter saying, well, we don't really want to, celebrate what you're asking us to celebrate because of things like this. Because of what you did in Paris to the Jews there. This is on page 102, halfway down the letter. We feel obliged to tell you that there are among us a certain number of Jews, but we make no distinction between Jews and non-Jews. It is contrary to the gospel teaching. If our comrades, whose only fault is to be born in another religion, received the order to let themselves be deported or even examined, they would disobey the orders received, and we would try to hide them as best we could. So at that point, it's no longer just under the surface behind the scenes resistance. The line has been drawn. So, page 104. Last paragraph there, somebody read that.
There was no fog for them because they cared enough to see and act. I'm sorry, I wanted to make sure it's on 104.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, there was no
Yeah.
fog for them
Yeah.
because they cared enough to see and to act and to be firm. The attentists, the waiting ones, who played bridge perhaps with friends, collaborators with Vichy, who expedited the deportation of foreign Jews from France, and the Nazis did not care for the victims of Nazism. That mixture of lucid knowledge, awareness of the pain of others, and stubborn decision dissipated for the Chambonnet, the night that inhabited the minds of so many people in Europe and the world at large in 1942.
So that's kind of their foundation and their core, right? It's their faith, but also their stubbornness, their Huguenot history and Andre Trocmé's history. The partnership between Trocmé and Thiess, they kind of balanced each other out like Luther and Melanchthon. So they saw through it. Even if they didn't know exactly what was happening, even if the stuff about the concentration camps wasn't out there yet, they smelled a rat.
Yeah, the fact they just uprooted them.
Yeah, they knew. They knew it wasn't right, whatever it was, they knew something.
Come in the middle of the night and take all family away. That can't be good.
Yeah, and then it goes into what actually happened at the stadium as history was able to piece it together later. We didn't run out of time. I want to get to the last couple ones that are really crucial here. Page 106. Basically, that they're not stupid. They're informed. They felt the pain of the Parisian Jews' suffering. Right? This is that last paragraph there. They cared about what had happened, cared enough not only to feel pain at the suffering of the victims, but also enough to make inferences about future events. They cared enough to think and plan, knowing by experience, this is from the letter, that the decrees of the occupying power are, with brief delay, will happen here too. Further, they announced that they would not be deceived by the free zone label applied to southern France. They cared enough to watch events closely and to see that there was a pattern. This is what we talked about before. Whatever happened in Germany would happen in the north of France, would happen in the south of France. Would somebody read paragraph top of page 107?
I have mentioned that it's impossible to draw a hard, clean line between what Coach May did, felt and thought and did, and what the rest of the Champagnes felt and thought and did. He was immersed in Charbonne, but his caring was important to theirs, and his caring came from a lifetime of concern. From the loss of his mother on, death had been part of his life, and he had hated it without hating the killer. As a young man in Belgium, he himself had been a refugee. These and other experiences had prepared him to care. They had sensitized and informed him so that his caring was fed by knowledge, and his knowledge was spurred by feeling.
That last line really stayed with me. I don't know about y'all, but his caring was fed by knowledge, and his knowledge was spurred by care. This cycle.
That's the way it should be. Then, you should have knowledge of something before you form your opinions.
Sure.
In my opinion,
Well,
That would be helpful.
verify what you're hearing.
Yeah.
Right,
Shouldn't
right.
repeat something because you
Yeah.
heard it. Because there are so many, I mean, thousands, millions of voices out there.
Well, and here,
Yeah.
even on TV, that you get different opinions on different.
And fairness doctrine.
Yeah.
Kept that at bay, but we don't have that anymore, opinions should be clearly labeled as opinions.
Yeah. Page 109. It talks about while they're searching the houses of Les Chambon and the farms, everybody else was in the temple for worship. Even people who aren't usually there, they all went there for that day. And it says that May and Tis are up on that high pulpit against the wall. I think there's a picture of that too. Yeah, there's that one. Yeah. That would be a little bit, you wouldn't be able to move around much while you're preaching up there. But they give this sermon, page 109. Little paragraph in the middle there. In the large rectangular chamber of the temple, the two pastors spoke from the high pulpit against the west wall, and what they presented to the people was a declaration that urged them to obey God rather than man when there is a conflict between the commandments of the government and the commandments of the Bible. Then it gets into, I was hoping we'd have time to look these passages up. We're running out of time though, but I still, maybe next week we can look these up about cities of refuge. And this concept from the Old Testament that is also carried through other times in Christian history where this hierarchy was used, You obey God rather than man when there's a conflict between the commandments of the government and the commandments of the Bible. Not always easy. Like we've said before, Civil War, both sides were quoting the Bible to justify what they were doing. But this sermon kind of again sums up where they were coming from. Down at the bottom of page 109, they quoted these things in the Bible about halfway down this paragraph. In the Bible, it is people guilty of what we now call involuntary manslaughter who are protected in the cities of refuge until they can be brought to fair trial. Because what else would have happened if they were left in their own villages? People would go after it, right? Sort of like a lynch mob. There's stories of that in the Old Testament too. Just meting out your own justice. But the Jews were being persecuted not because of any crime, voluntary or involuntary, but only because they were Jews. Chocolate and Tees must have felt that these modern Jews were all the more deserving of refuge because of their utter innocence of any crime or even any charge. In any case, the ministers were concerned only with safeguarding the weak from the unjust hatred of their pursuers, and they were willing to ignore other aspects of the city of refuge passages of the Bible, right? So they used the lens of Jesus's gospel to interpret these Old Testament cities of refuge. A canon within a canon kind of a thing. Then, shoot, I don't have time. Page, just as you go down this page, it kind of helps pair out how they do this, how do they faithfully as possible pick and choose the scriptures that guide them. To me, this made me think of Martin Luther's explanation of the Ten Commandments again. So not only should you not murder, but you should uphold people's lives, right? So it might just, you might just pat yourself on the back for saying like, hey, I didn't murder anybody today, I didn't steal anything. But what they're doing is what Luther spells out in the Small Catechism. It's not just what you don't do. It's what you do on top of that, and what you do instead. How do you support life? Think of Good Samaritan laws too. By the time we get to the end of the chapter, we hear about how the carry was infectious. So their active resistance started internally with the town, inspiring folks that bird that they saw, right? Oh, there's a colorful bird. I'm going to remember this bird. This is possible. And then as they all coalesce around this, it spreads to others. Even the folks that are supposed to be cracking down on them can't help but be affected by what they're doing. Yeah. What do you think? Last thoughts?
I think it's interesting. We were over there 25 years later. Nobody talked about any of this. You know, and in France, they just were so excited to get the American dollars that nobody brought up anything that had ever happened to them. In Amsterdam, we did go to the home Van Frank. That was still there, but the signs of the war were wiped out. People didn't talk about it, you know, at all. I think there were mixed feelings about the Americans being there. They probably wish we wouldn't there, but we certainly contributed to their economy. Yeah.
Were the things in place that are there now, all the monuments and all of the statues and plaques all around Berlin and other parts of Germany that are like the constant reminders?
Berlin, the thing I remember the most was the clock in the church that was stopped at the hour it was bombed, and it was never replaced or set. You
From
know,
what I understand nowadays, you can't go anywhere without seeing something to say, don't ever let this happen.
I don't remember that. The wall was still up. You know.
That's true.
That was kind of impressive because the train, you were warned, get off at such and such a stop because you did not want to end up in the other side.
So maybe some of that's been added since the law.
Yeah.
When Mark and I were in Europe, in Portugal and Italy last year, every place we went on the stores would show us like where Jewish people had lived, where Jewish people were protected.
Sure.
There was I actually went into Spain, and I think this was in Spain. They sheltered their Jewish families by creating a sausage that was made out of chicken, I think. Typically sausage is made out of unclean foods, and but everybody had sausage hanging, right? So
yeah, it was always.
exactly, and so that was how they
Yeah.
would identify Jewish people, and so they created this, this kosher sausage, and it was really heartwarming to not only to know that these things happen, but that today's people are, acknowledging,
Sure.
memorializing, and sharing that.
Well, that, I think it must have come later because in the late.
Right, probably.
In the late sixties,
last year.
yeah, they did not talk about it.
That right there, I think, links back to what they were saying. What we started with. When you look at the atrocity of the Holocaust, not just Jews, so many people.
Oh, yeah.
Millions and millions and millions of people killed. You might look at a story like this or hear about sausages, kosher sausages, and think, well, that's a drop in the bucket, right? But those small things are still that bird that we see that says, oh, I can do this, I can resist, I can stand up when such things happen, whether it's a government or a neighbor or a joke somebody makes or a policy, anything that is harming your neighbor. It is possible to speak up or to do something to stand up for your neighbor.
In this generation, though, we don't have the scriptural background to refer to as the Quakers did at that time. We don't have all these stories.
So maybe that's one of the church's failings. Maybe that's one of the reasons why the church is diminishing in so many places. is because we got into the business model and the marketing model, right? Let's get people in the pews and let's have the country club with a steeple on top. And there's many, many good things about the churches that we have grown up with. That there's a sense of community here and that you feel safe here and comfortable here. But if the church is kind of given up, not given up, but like tucked away,
I think
that side of things, maybe that's one of the reasons why we're kind of fading.
I think the church as a whole got very complacent.
Yeah.
In fact, there was always, people always went, and so there was no cause to alarm, and by the time they realized it was too late. The door had been open and
Yeah.
the beast got out and they couldn't figure out how to get the door closed fast
And
enough.
it makes sense, right? You make it through the wars, you make it through the trials, you make it to the point where you finally have peace. And you're just like, oh, well, I don't wanna dredge all that back up again. I don't wanna get in trouble. I don't wanna
Alienated.
alienate anybody. I don't wanna upset any apple carts. So let's just keep it safe. Let's just keep it healthy, right? So if the church loses that prophetic side of it, then maybe that's part of the reason why we are where we are and why other folks are now stepping forward to say, well, this is why we need to stand up for people. And why a lot of churches are like, well, we don't wanna get in trouble. I wanna keep this going, but we gotta stop. I gotta go. Thank you. Oh, yeah. Okay, next week, we're just doing one section per week, so the next section is part 3, called Help, chapters 5, 6, and 7.
5, 6, and 7?
Yep.
I actually won't be here next week, we're going to Canada.
All right.
Like I said, probably been anything.
Oh, that's.
You